know how members of Congress get reelected like 98% of the time? And that's a big reason why people don't feel like their vote counts? Well, a big reason that happens is called redistricting, where politicians spread out the voters in a state and draw new lines around the congressional districts and state legislative districts. Essentially, politicians are picking their voters rather than voters picking their politicians. It's pretty messed up. The issue is so important that former President Obama has made it the main focus of his political activity now that he's no longer president. And he even created a group called the National Democratic Redistricting Committee to coordinate campaign strategy, direct fundraising, organize ballot initiatives, and put together legal challenges to state redistricting maps. But now there's a Supreme Court case that could finally put a stop to the political practice of gerrymandering, because it gives one party an advantage in elections over the other party's candidates by drawing really whack lines that make it impossible for challenger candidates to win, hence the 98% re-election rate. So Democrats in some states draw lines that drastically disadvantage Republicans, and Republicans in most states disenfranchise the voting rights of minorities and other traditionally Democratic voters so they can win. And the big problem about that is that Republicans are dominating Democrats in most state legislature. So the problem is just getting worse and worse over time. The good news is that the Supreme Court is taking up an appeal from the state of Wisconsin. A lower court ruling found that their 2011 redistricting plan was unconstitutional. And the ruling against the state has thus far been upheld by both a federal district court in the state of Wisconsin and by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. In this election, the proportion of state seats won by Republicans was significantly different from the proportion of statewide votes. So even though they got less votes overall, they picked up more seats because gerrymandering. The state's 2011 gerrymandering effort employed both cracking and packing. In the case of cracking, districts are drawn in such a way so as to dilute the influence of a certain class of voters, while in the case of packing, large numbers of voters of a certain class are packed into the same district. It gets pretty racist. You know, just draw all the black people into one district and then spread out all the white nationalists evenly throughout the state, and bang, Republicans can win the state house and pass all kinds of crazy laws. One liberal advocacy group commented on Monday's announcement from the Supreme Court saying, quote, "For too long, the important task of redistricting has resembled a back alley brawl. No rules, no referees, no holds barred. And technology has made it easier than ever for self-interested legislators to manipulate districts for political advantage. So it is essential that the courts step in to protect voters' fundamental constitutional rights." Earlier this year, the Supreme Court ruled on a gerrymandering case, but that case dealt with racial minorities being unfairly impacted, not political parties. So in the case from earlier this year, the Supreme Court, even Clarence Thomas, sided with African-American voters from North Carolina who said their political influence was unfairly held back by state redistricting efforts. And this case gives the Supreme Court the opportunity to rule on an issue even more widely applicable than that of racially discriminatory redistricting, which is illegal under the Voting Rights Act. But the current ruling would have far more reaching implications, because up until now, there has been no Supreme Court ruling preventing politicians from picking their voters in the way that undermine free and fair elections in America. Steve Vladek, a CNN Supreme Court analyst and professor of law at the University of Texas School of Law, stated that he believes that this case has the potential to shape up to be the most important case of its type taken up by the court in recent years, adding that it will likely have enormous ramifications. Here's what he said, quote, "The justices have never been able to identify the specific point at which states cross the constitutional line. In this case, a lower court held that Wisconsin had indeed crossed that line. If the justices agree, it would be the first time the court has articulated a constitutional rule in this context, which likely would have enormous ramifications nationwide." Josh Douglas, a law professor at the University of Kentucky College of Law who specializes in election law and voting rights, added this, quote, "This will be the biggest and most important election law case in decades. However the court rules will affect elections for years to come." So there's some hope that even in the era of Trump, we can fix some of the problems that have obstructed progress in America for decades. However, the Supreme Court is still dominated by conservatives since they stole a Supreme Court nomination from Obama by refusing to approve his nominee, and instead allowed Trump to appoint a permanent pick to the Supreme Court who will remain there even long after Trump resigns or gets impeached. I'm Ryan Clayton. This is Content News. Come back daily for the news where we're free to share the truth.